Sometimes, yeah. Ironically, for a country with so many different historic capitals, the lack of capital right now is a problem that open government completely have overlooked. The main claim here is that this is disastrous economically. The thesis is that well over 1 billion people, plus not just them, but also obviously all the people they trade with, which a lot of the world. It's like the second biggest economy, I think. It's like up there. And it's like pretty huge. Like so many different core actors who've grown based on Chinese consumption, which as per this is going down. Probably not great. We're just going to go through this through the info side because there's a nice structure that he gave us. For this. Deflation. Why is this really bad? Well, because when you have deflation, people have the inherent incentive, as the PM concedes, to save because your money is going to be worth more. Why would you buy something now when it's going to be worth more later? Your money's worth more later, things worth less. With that, then, you have the huge incentive to just not invest. Why would you invest in this inherent risk in that? The business could fail, and then when you return on your investment, you will keep up with the returns you get from just holding your money in a mattress or something. But secondly, crucially, adapting on foreign investment. What that means is literally that there were people investing in clubs like AC Milan, so it makes sense. And then in these situations, then we had so much money going out in all across the world from China, right? Whether it be through the BRI, which is pretty great, which we'll touch on later, or other things such as trying to invest in football clubs, which is a more niche thing. But also crucially, then it definitely means no one was investing back. What does that mean? It means you have capital fleeing. It's going away. You don't have the capital within your country, and the rich actors in your country had some capital built up. Basically, this enterprise has wasted it on being not good at running AC Milan because they had to sell it and they didn't do a good job there. That's not really important, but you know what I mean. Crucially, then, both of these three things mean where are you getting the money? Obviously not from American loans or something. Where are you getting the money in different places? How will you have the upfront capital to massively remodernize the labor force in ways that also they would have done to the ships and it didn't work. If the CCP were so great and they wanted to modernize their economy in all the ways that Dylan says, they would have already done so earlier. They said, oh, it's the different situations, but I don't know. I feel like they would have kept half the population happy by enfranchising women into the workforce earlier. It seems that they have the incentive to do that anyway. But separately, broadly. And China just doesn't have the huge upfront money to do all of the things that they want. And the rest of this time is going to say that because of that, they're unlikely to overcome the problems, and it's going to be disastrous. At the very least, the effects on growth for China, for people in it, or the countries in trade with, is disastrous. With that then, C, unemployment. This is incredibly toxic, especially when the legacy of the one-child policy means many families depend on just one child still. And if that child is now unemployed, that means not one person who can't feed themselves, but they also can't feed their father and their mother, who are left out and need more government support, which is again more money, and where are you getting it from? Or then the CCP will have to turn to things like such subsistence farming, or using more exploitative work of minorities such as Uyghurs in different ways, and increasing unfair incarceration of such communities to be able to then make the food and the goods to fill this gap, which would obviously be a further humanitarian abuse and horrible. But D, separately, on real estate, just crucially, China had in 2008. The reason why China's real estate market was over leveraged, despite being able to potentially learn from the West, was that the femicide of the one-child policy was that because basically young baby girls were killed because they'd be less likely to be able to provide for the family in the long term. If you only have one child to bank on, you then want a boy, right? The femicide that result on that just led to a real population imbalance. There were far more boys and far more men in China than women. And what that meant was if you wanted to get married, you often needed to buy 2 homes, which made homes really valuable. You needed to show that you were a wealthy person, so you buy multiple homes. It's true. You can't get that's not true. I literally met multiple reasons why. It obviously means you are richer, you have more luxuries, you can give them multiple places to live. It's obviously a bit of a perk, I guess. It's a green flag. I don't know. In this situation, then, what you've had is a huge overleveraging. But the COVID slowdown meant that many people with mortgages and things like that could not pay it through. And thus you had Evergrande, the huge real estate firm, collapsing. It's like a banker real estate firm. It's one of the 2 things together. And with that then, crucially as well, if you want to rely on the Chinese financial sector to get the money, it too is in utter disarray right now. So you're not going to get the capital from there either, which means, again, you're not going to be able to overcome this. But also it means when they want to talk about, subsidized building homes, with who? Real estate is collapsing. How are you going to be able to avoid that collapse? You're not going to be able to subsidize homes. You're trying to make sure that these homes don't stop getting built at all. You're not going to add extra homes suddenly, magically, with the struggling real estate sector. But E, the reduction in domestic consumption is incredibly pernicious because crucially, when you are trying to make that transition from a producer economy to a consumer economy, more advanced goods that Dylan talks about, what you need is people who are able to buy those advanced goods, who are consuming en masse to increase the investment for people to make more of them and have more growth within these sectors. But if consumption's going down, you can't bridge that gap. You need a pool of money and consumers buying and buying and buying for these new businesses to survive when they are making this shift. And crucially then, this shift from like a middle income economy to a higher income economy is being completely jeopardized by this. And also that means they aren't able to consume things that they get from elsewhere. Like Southeast Asian goods, which are imported into China, whole economies built off of that through free trade agreements, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Plan, or East African agriculture, which is the breadbasket for China, and the ways in which they're employed so many farmers within that region who now won't be able to give their food because China will just have to rely on its own food as consumption of different kinds of like food options is going down.
What's the counterfactual? Do all these issues just disappear on the opposition side, or do they exist?
It's just a point motion. Like we're saying, like the effects of this are bad. I don't care. But crucially, then, what this means is that poverty kills for not just the people within China, for all the countries now that are not growing as a result of this decreased consumption. Because when you're unemployment, you cannot feed yourself or your family. You cannot have healing. You cannot grow as an economy to lead to increased quality of life, to be able to have infrastructure such as heating and different roads and things to ensure access to hospitals. And that kills people continuously and causes suffering, and so we should obviously oppose this motion. The second broad claim here is just that this will make CCP behavior far worse. Why is this true? Well, A, because if you need to get money from somewhere, first of all, you've already kind of sucked it into the BRI, but now you have to recall BRI loans. You have to make people that default, you have to do worse conditions, where in the past BRI had like 3% default and was probably helping growing places across Southeast Asia and East Africa. Now instead will be used to take those ports back and China will act perniciously. But separately as well, it just means it needs to rely on things like misinformation, because it can't say, look at our good numbers. It has to fudge the numbers to keep the population happy and to keep keeping perceived as strong on the international stage. And also, as pointed out, it means further use of horrible slave labor. There's just so many reasons why we should oppose this. But obviously, it's disastrous economically, and China doesn't have the capability to do everything that the PM dreams they can. Thank you.
Ready? Oh. Okay, sorry. Starting I want to deal first of all what's just come out of the last speaker. So on this idea that you can use your central bank to print more money, basically liquidate, and then in the long term get that paid back. There's a lot of reasons why that would be a terrible thing for China to do and hurt a lot of people, both in China and internationally. Would be something that this actor quite unlikely to do. Even if there was capacity, I think again, opening government has failed to prove both capacity, likelihood, and beneficial impact to their entire case. They've done 1 to 2 of all 3 of those things, but never all 3 to prove their case. I will explain that as I go through. But on this, like, let's print more money and make everything fine case that we've heard out of the last speaker. One, you can't just do a lot of these things when you internationalize your currency to the extent that the Chinese government have internationalized their currency. The reason for this is a couple of things. First of all, there are countries around the world that have tied their economies to the Chinese currency. There are loans within the Chinese currency around the world, given the Belt and Road system. There are governments and different economies that have bonds connected to this. At the point where, and this before I even get into economic impact, I want to talk about political perception of your the strength of your currency massively deflating your economy. So post-Brexit, even before anything had hit, even before any economic impact had actually hit the sterling, it was international perception that bad economic policy would weaken the currency, actually then also just weakened the currency. Because people stopped investing, using sterling for a while. International markets stopped supporting it sufficiently. And that is one of the most stable currencies to have ever existed. The difference, however, is when you are an up and coming, I suppose, global economic power, you need international support within your currency. I think at the point where you are a government that does one of the most historically recognized policies of tanking an economy, which is to print more money, it seems unlikely that the international economic or international financial, I suppose, community supports those decisions. The reason for this is when you print more money, whilst in the very, very short term does allow some of the benefits that opening government wants to talk about, in the long term it means things like you've printed so much money that your money becomes so worthless that in the most extreme cases, bread in like Germany used to cost millions. But in a more realistic sense, I mean, you never get to build back the money that they want to talk about because you're consistently raising the prices of everything to meet the fact that you have printed more money. Business owners still need to pay their bills. They also have to pay it with the more money that has been printed. Everything goes up. You put false faith into your currency rather than actually solving your economic problems. Let me talk to you about, secondly, on this in particular, foreign goods then become almost impossible or a lot more expensive for you to engage with, because yes, internally maybe you've solved some of your problems, you've printed more money and people can invest internally within your government, within your borders. But at the point where you need to and want to engage in trade to develop, A, to develop your economy, but B, to keep your local population happy. Because note, China in the last 10 to 15 years did already make the move that Dylan wanted to talk about. They moved toward creating a local middle class, creating second sector jobs. So they did less things like subsistence farming. It meant that things like Vietnam in the region is the country that grows a lot of the rice and grain and things that a lot of the poorest people within China need to eat and survive. So you now in opening government, you give them 2 options. Either with an inflated currency, it now becomes even more expensive for them to buy the basic necessities from their neighbors that they had moved to doing, or you push them back into subsistence farming. You push them back further in their economic growth because you push them back into a point where they have to do that to feed themselves. If opening government want to worry about the worst and the most people facing most inequality within China, it would make it a lot worse to the point where they can't afford to feed their families internally and push them back on their cycle.
Are these the only issues facing the Chinese economy, or are there other structural problems?
Yeah, it's not. Right. I think the info side explained it. I think Jack has explained it. I actually do have a few that I go through. I'm not going to list it in a response to POI. If my speech covers it for you, great. If not, I look forward to your extension. Okay, the inequality that opening government wants to solve. A couple of things. It seems really unclear that opening government ever foresees the likelihood that it would be women and minorities and the underprivileged groups that are the ones that the Chinese government use to stimulate their economy. And I know Dylan tries to say that they give reasons for this. They say, you go into untapped workforces. Info slide and common sense. If you have an unemployed youth, it is them that you do the policies that you talk about. Who are those unemployed youth? They are the young men that Jack told you about. They are, and why is it the likely scenario? It is more clear that the CCP will prioritize these people. Why? First of all, they are the people that the people who support the CCP expect to get jobs. I.e., if you are the new built up middle class, or indeed the working class in non-regional areas, like non-rural areas, you expected that growth to continue. You expected your children to be able to be profitable. You are angry that your son now isn't able to get the job that you were promised and expected for them, meaning that if the CCP are going to do anything like giving jobs to people, it is going to be to these men. Secondly, it seems unclear that opening governments ever meet their burden of telling you that the revolution will happen. I know Emily gives you some nice stuff as to why it is when power is weakened you can call them out. The CCP is still the friggin' CCP, right? Recession tends to not be very good for minority people. Why? Because the majority population get more angry when you're not solving their problem and you're solving the problems of women and Uyghurs and people that they have been told for generations are less worthy than loyal CCP following good Chinese population. Obviously not my opinion, but the opinion of those people. It seems unclear why these people now have the strength to critique authoritarian states when China still has the largest standing army in the world, still has legitimacy of stopping protests in the street, has been able to show that it's willing to do that. Secondly, if you have a large young male unemployed group, strong thing you can do, give them jobs in the CCP, give them jobs in the state. It seems unclear that you get that development. What do you prefer, right? It seems unclear. Sorry, actually, no. It just seems again unclear that you get the short-term likelihood. Sorry, opening government want you to say that they do this nice economic policy that Dylan described because it has long-term goals. CCP tends to have always supported short-term benefits. Why so? You saw historically they would do things like build airports in the middle of nowhere just to give people jobs and to create money for people. Secondly, rising up within the CCP bureaucracy often requires showing quick numbers to be able to rise up through the ranks. Meaning, we do not support something that has happened that has led to all of the harms Jack talked about on individuals within China, which is a very large group, but equally weakens the Chinese state and makes them more authoritarian, more harmful, harms a lot of people. Beg you to oppose.
That's their final speech, and I warmly call upon the member of government here.
No.
The Chinese economy is essentially like, if I'm going to be polite, right? It's like a ticking time bomb. Like the planned economy, like inevitably leads to economic mismanagement. They manipulate their currency, right? Like it's nobody's business. And like if they go to war, their currency will completely die out, right? And we think it's much better to get it's much better the countries who are currently dependent on China, get out now rather than later, right? We're going to tell you in this debate about the impact on countries outside of China and why this is so important. But firstly, just a few mechanisms that we think the Chinese government is much more likely to use than the ones of boosting fiscal stimulus, right? We think that in a case where you've got a country with massive wealth inequality, higher even than the United States, that actually if you've got a massive economic crash, you can just have a more even allocation of capital. So if someone has $1 billion, you take that billion and then you parcel it up into little chunks and you give it to lots of other people, right? Who now have more money and are better off than they are under the other things, right? We think that the Chinese Communist Party probably will raise taxes, right? Then more money literally goes into government investment, goes to poor people, right? They'll expropriate assets from billionaires as they've done with Jack Ma, right? So what we want to tell you primarily in this debate, right, is that this reduces the ability of China to run its kind of neo-colonialist, imperialist foreign policy, and we're also going to tell you about how the decline of Chinese manufacturing will be extremely good for countries like India and Bangladesh, who have very poor population and low levels of industrialization, right? So like, firstly, about like just the characterization of how China currently dominates other countries economically. Well, we think they use money, right? Like we don't think that the Chinese government is going to like go like send soldiers into countries, but because they don't kind of like, that's not really their style. They instead use things like the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Like we get some like stuff from where like, yeah, the Chinese government is a massive charity who like really love other countries and therefore they give like super generous debt, all this stuff, right? Like this is completely untrue, right? Like the Chinese government, like they want to get access to raw materials in Africa. Like firstly, there's like just like actual kind of racism against black people in China, right? Like we don't think they really care about people in Africa, but they're also like much more interested in supporting their domestic population, getting access to these raw minerals resources, right? It means that they give things like their surveillance tech to dictators. They give things like extra funding to like these oppressive regimes so that they can get the resources, right? We think they also like they're super keen on like debt traps, punitive investment, like for example, like you see in Australia, like they're buying up ports, like closing them down to try to blackmail the government and manipulate them in this way. Like in Pakistan, they're taking control of lots of domestic infrastructure, right? Which we think is really bad. So what happens right now on our side, right, where the Chinese economy like is much weaker? Well, we think the Chinese government tried to cut some costs, right? And we think that the first costs to be cut are very likely to be those to do with foreign policy, right? Like, why is this? Well, like, just there's kind of like bias, right? Like, it's much further away, so people care about it less, right? Like, if you're a member of like the Politburo and you're kind of walking around in Beijing, right? Like, you actually see things that like concretely happen in Beijing. Thank you. You don't really like. Obviously, you do see like where things happen in Africa, but not like immediately and directly, right? Like, secondly, we think that like it's quite easy to cut these programs because like people in China don't really like necessarily know about like different bits of like Chinese government foreign policy or like which bits of sovereign debt the Chinese government owns, but they kind of do know about like little bits of like what the Chinese government spends its money on investing, right? So we think that like China is very likely to cut this kind of foreign aid. Also, because like you don't see the impact immediately, right? Like if you cut the education budget or the health budget, you do see this much more quickly. So what we think this means, right, is like when you have less money, you spend less money on like building up, for example, like massive installation, military installation on the Indian border, right? Like immediate massive benefit. No, like less tension with a massive nuclear power. Like India has to spend have to spend less money on its military, right? Because like the Chinese government is no longer mapping like massive installations and like the ability to mobilize like hundreds of thousands of soldiers in a couple of weeks. But we think that like also when other countries now negotiate with China, they don't think of China as like as strong, and that they're able to push back more on the Chinese government, right? Because you realize now that the Chinese government doesn't have the kind of resources that it otherwise would have to like, go and buy out bits of infrastructure in your country through like some shell companies or something, and like sink the whole thing until you eventually give in, right? Which we think is really good because it now means that like China's neighbors are no longer dominated by it in an extremely unfair way, right? Then they got some like nonsense about like, China will force the creditors to like repay the entire loan immediately. This is not how sovereign debt works, right? Like, firstly, you can only force repayments from a creditor who like in arrears, like a debtor who's in arrears, right? Like if they are paying this up on time, like you can't force them to repay faster, right? That's usually how government bonds work, right? Like, secondly, the ones who like the sovereign. If you own sovereign debt from a country who are in default, right? Like they're in default. There's no money to be had there, right? If they had money, they wouldn't really be in default in the same way, right? Like secondly, even if there is some money you could possibly squeeze out of them, we don't think that you can restructure the sovereign debt in the same way, right? Because like for example, in other countries, it's not just you're not the only creditor. Like people like the IMF will also own this stuff. The IMF don't exactly like China. They're not going to be like, yes, we'd like to restructure this loan to be able to like help China get more money out, right? We think this is something that they're going to oppose. We think that actually like what will happen realistically is the Chinese government will like, probably offload its sovereign debt to other investors, like for example, like to US institutions or to private companies who are actually interested, like not in dominating these countries, but like just want to like run a sensible commercial arrangement. Yeah, sure.
Right. So African leaders are not fools. Up until now, the BRI and China have been able to give them positive deals and good rates back with very little funding. You change those incentives on your side.
They're not positive deals with positive funding, right? Like in the short term, they work very well, right? Because the Chinese government are like, okay, we'll build like a piece of infrastructure here, and then like you don't have to pay anything immediately, right? So it seems pretty good. But then in the long term, like you have to pay them like massive amounts of interest payments, massive amounts of debt back, right? So it kind of that's the whole point of a debt trap, right? It sounds really nice, like you fall into it, and then you're in the trap and you're snared. The second, I just want to tell you, right, that the decline of Chinese manufacturing has been really good, will be really good for other poor countries, right? Because like currently most manufacturing is done in China. We think like firstly already like massive overreach from the Chinese government makes it really hard to do business, right? Like you have to like bribe local port officials, like you often have to find like a Chinese partner who like actually might be trying to steal your entire business, and they can do this because they have local contacts that you don't. We think that like you find it quite difficult to get credit, and we think like Western companies offer some IP credit. Then when the Chinese economy declines, right, it makes it a much harder place to do business in China. Like you can't get get credit, you can't find many employees because of the aging population. Like you're more worried about the rhetoric of Xi Jinping. So where do you go now, right? When the Chinese like economy has kind of fallen, well, we think you go to like more like friendly countries. This means that you move your manufacturing to India and Bangladesh, right? Like immediate massive benefit, beneficial impact, right? It means that like India and Bangladesh now get a huge impact, huge influx of foreign direct investment, which I think is extremely positive for these countries because like even on like on a per dollar basis, it's going to make a much bigger difference like more investment in China because they're less industrialized. It means that these countries like can get industrial development, can get the kind of economic growth that China has previously experienced. It means that citizens can become wealthier, they get more opportunities, and that we are able to like on the our side of the house, right? Like we get much better outcomes in these really like massive countries, with, like millions of people. Just like in a way that we don't on their side of the house. So for all those reasons, I'm incredibly proud to be president.
I speak for their fine speech, and I warmly call upon a member of the
The stream going.
Yes, just muted and just video.
Okay, group stage.
We know.
I do love that the Irish like work for the groups. It's like come on, sure.
More accurate representation, like collegians.
Also true.
Like in rounds where you get the best speaker.
That's why you're there to win at the tournament, isn't it?
Did we win or do we not speak?
I haven't looked at this house, I've honestly no idea. Yeah, neither.
Okay. All good.
Yeah, thanks.
I want to sort of respond to the opening government, not only because I respect them tremendously as well, but because I think they deserve a better response than China simply doesn't have the money. I'd like to assume that there exists a massive financial capacity for China to respond to the thing in the way that they say, that it will significantly respond to aggregate demand. Let's address the 6 mechanisms that they provide us. The first one is that the first thing is that there's massive level of economic stimulus. How do they expect this to happen? The first one is that there is a massive level of industrialization and upscaling. I want to ask a question where. I think if this does happen, it is likely only going to benefit the existing industrial or metropolitan hubs. I want to note here, this is the minority of people within China. Yes, there exist very known cities like Shanghai and Beijing, but most of the people oftentimes live outside these cities, and more specifically, if there were going to be a response, it would be localized to these areas for 2 reasons. The first reason is that these are the primary locations of direct foreign direct investment, and as such, China has a measurable economic incentive to do it. No, there are not things like political incentives because most people, Chinese people, don't have the ability to have things like lobbying power for voting. Instead, there exists no capacity for the average person to do it. Yes, they say that it is important for the Chinese government that people buy into it, but note here, there's oftentimes overwhelming societal factors that people buy into even more. The fact that China often functions as that bulwark or counterbalance to the US. Those are overarchingly more valuable, and I think will allow people in the short term to stomach short-term economic harms. Let's look at then the second claim, subsidization of housing values, and somehow people are like young people are going to take 60K loans and throw this money back into the economy. The question becomes then, because no, it isn't a issue of production of housing. There exists a massive surplus of housing in the places. It's a problem with incentive. Why do people have the want to do this, given that they themselves understand that there is in the short term and economic crunch? People understand economics, even at the base level, and they understand that why would I take a loan at this instance? I do question whether or not this meaningfully materializes. Second claim, that there exists a massive incentive to upscale people and trade, transport, and healthcare. Note here, all of this investment would be large-scale infrastructure projects like expansions of like metropolitan and subway lines in places like Beijing that would meaningfully only benefit the immediate periphery of these cities, nowhere else. Maybe there is a bus line created in rural China. This does not meaningfully better any one of these places. I want to note here, they say that it is going to massively emancipate cultural minorities and women. 2 things here. There exist overwhelming social narratives that facilitate the exploitation of these people. These will not be removed because there is a cultural level of incentive to exploit them. I do think this is relatively ubiquitous, and the same reason for women. I think there exists things like the fundamental ability that women aren't able to access things like welfare unless they are married, that fundamentally subjugate them within the space of these spaces. I am unsure as to whether they came to a reasonable extent that there is the emancipation of these groups. The last thing then is that there exists a want to shift into textual expertise. Again, there needs to be a very honest evaluation of the Chinese economy. It is deeply over-leveraged. For decades, they have been trading off against their capacity to gain some level of global power. They have been leveraging all of their economic power, devaluing their currency to maintain the value of their exports, creating massive level of influence through massive infrastructure investments through the Belt and Road initiatives. These have meaningfully bettered people's lives across the world. I think it is flippant from the government bench to say that we should not consider the weight of these investments because it is easy to default to myths like debt trap diplomacy and some level of fear mongering around the Chinese state because they don't allow people to vote and maybe they don't have they're not red, white, and blue, they're just red and yellow. I want to note a few claims here in direct opposition, my last response to the opening government. The first one is how do people and how states generally respond to crisis? Do they accurately say, let me consider my actions and take full responsibility for this? Which state does this? No. They double down on existing narratives of the West persecuting them. They double down on the existing things and oftentimes will fall back into significant things. The DPM says that they will honestly just recount their reflections and say, we've done such a bad group. This is a government that has firstly removed the checks and balances on powers like term limits. There exists no capacity for these people to say, it is my fault and I will do better. Importantly here, they said that there is no fallout for the BRI. And I'm not sure that China will immediately pull back the money or points out, but I think more specifically, it stagnates the current and the hundreds of economic and significant infrastructure projects that are across the world. This is important because in these places, the existence of dams and ports and railways are meaningfully have meaningful impact in people's lives. I will take the opening government before I move on.
So a lot of the rest of the debate has the cart before the horse, discussing causes of the crisis, not consequences of it. The economic realpolitik override political enfranchisement in China.
But I will be honest with you, I'm really not sure what economic realpolitik exists, but I do think I can respond to your claim in two ways. The first one is even if there does exist an incentive to do it, they will do it poorly and they do it in such a way that it benefits people who have existing capacity. And this way, I think we're able to beat your team. What then do we say to the opening opposition? Because I think that they have two very important ideas that we meaningfully stand upon. The first one is that it stops investment. I want to rich mechanization meaningfully compound the effect of it. It is not good enough to say that AC Milan got mismanaged and therefore we should deal with that. They flagged the BRI, but I want to know on a personal level how these things work. In South Africa, China is the person who's facilitated the two largest solar wind farms in the place of this. This is a country that for decades was cash strapped and it has a massive inability to develop its own electrical capacity. It is literally the ability of people in the developing world to switch on their light and immediately engage in some level of economic impact. This is important because it might sound as if we're derivative if you squint your eyes, but it is important. This impact is meaningfully compelling and different. Note the second claim is that it harms Chinese people. Even within this, they don't function to understand the consequence of what happens when China falters as a counterweight to a lot of the existing imperialism. And at this point, I have to step in and try and address the egregious characterizations that we get for the closing government. I think there's a tremendous debate, but they fall into two very, very harmful traits. The first one is some level of fetishization of the US. I will be honest with you, I think the US is one of the worst countries in the world. It is single-handedly one of the most greatest proprietors of violence and despair and death, settler colonialism, genocide, only superseded by maybe the British Empire. And I want to look here at a few direct consequences. It is not simply that China is not capable of things like neocolonialism. It is where you're as a small nation to take the best of two bad options. Where are you able to create an understanding that when you have two competing groups of people with massive geopolitical power, are you able to leverage and create some level of benefit as a small nation? This is the claim from Rick, is that US unilateralism has universally fucked every developing nation that has created some level of economic trade with them. Look at Zambia and its inability, once it was forced into pivoting away from agrarian development into massive industrialization and something that has never been able to account from. But I think even more flippantly, they said that there exists meaningful alternatives to China. I want to know something about China. It is a massive economic juggernaut with a significant and capacity that's only rivaled by the United States. They said that India and Bangladesh might have the capacity to do this, and BRICS now has expanded. Ethiopia cannot function as a meaningful country in terms of economic trade here, but more specifically, India and Bangladesh have similar characteristics, but not in terms of economic capacity. Yes, they have the same amount of people, but they don't have the same mere strength in terms of technological and provision of services. Yes, there exists a massive country, but India itself is structured internally. Look at the agrarian sector and how it is failing. There exists no meaningful capacity for it to step in and mediate conflict. Where does this leave us in terms of the debate? Closing government, closing opposition will be three things. The first one is not only does the harm manifest in a meaningful way to every single person, that China functions as a meaningful alternative in terms of the geopolitical space, but it isn't about the simple principle of right or wrong. It's where they're able to create some level of alternative in a system where there exists no good options, where it is simply good enough to say that if there exists a counterbalance, we can meaningfully engage in systems of discourse. If we understand the global game of geopolitical politics is unfair, we allow people to leverage their own unique circumstances for the best option, and oftentimes that is China.
My speech. Well, would you mind turning off the streaming and audio, guys? Before you go, so first of all, thank you for that debate. It was excellent. I